One of the most amazing things that the cell phone in your pocket can do is it can tell you how to get to where you want to go. You can pull up Google Maps or Apple Maps, you can type in the address of the place you want to go to, and it will give you directions. And if you turn up the volume, it will even give you step-by-step instructions out loud. It will say things like, in 1/4 mile, turn right. And it's really remarkable what it can do. I've noticed that you can actually change the language on the GPS. So it will give you instructions in all kinds of different languages. One time several years ago, my son Caleb changed the language on my GPS to French, and I couldn't figure out how to turn it back. And I had no idea how to get where I was going, but I sure did sound classy while I was on my way there. You can set it to Australian English or British English. I'm mildly disappointed there is not an option for Southern Redneck English as one of the voices. It would say something like, y'all are going to turn right up there at the DG. But that's not really an option that it has. I also have noticed that on my Google Maps, all the voices are female. And I want to be clear, this doesn't bother me. I don't mind taking instructions from a female voice. I'm not saying anything there. But it is interesting when I'm driving and Gayla and Sarah are in the car and the GPS is on, I have 3 different women giving me helpful driving tips at the same time. And that can be a little overwhelming. But anyway, but here's the thing about that GPS. You have to decide if you're going to do what it says. It doesn't turn the wheel for you. It doesn't actually get you to your destination. It just tells you how to get there. And then you have to decide if you're going to listen and heed the words of that thing that your phone is telling you to do. Are you going to follow? Well, the same dilemma strikes us as we hear the words of Jesus. And for the last several weeks, we've been exploring his profound teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. And he's telling us all these remarkable things. And we have to decide if we're going to do what he says. We've got all these options. When we hear his words, we can study them, we can admire them, we can agree with them, we can do all of this, and yet we've got to decide, are we going to actually do what he says? And as we reach the end of the Sermon on the Mount this morning, we're going to hear Jesus making it clear that what matters most is that we put his words into practice. Are we going to do what he tells us to do? We're going to see in these closing words of the sermon that Jesus paints 3 powerful, simple word pictures that each give us 2 stark options. Are we going to do this or this? Are we going to be this or this? And in each case, he's calling us to decide what we're going to do with his words and what we're going to do with him. So we're going to examine all 3 of those word pictures this morning. We're going to pay the most attention to the third one, but let's dive in. The first word picture, picture number 1, is the 2 roads. The 2 roads. Look at Jesus' words in Matthew 7, verses 13 and 14. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Jesus calls us to picture ourselves standing before 2 gates. One of them is really wide, and on the other side of that wide gate is a nice wide road, and lots of people are going through that gate and taking that road. It is definitely the in road. It is the trendy road. Over on the other side is a narrow gate, and if you squeeze through it, you get to a narrow road. Jesus says, take that narrow gate. Go on that narrow way. Now, it's important to remember that the most important feature of a road is its destination. It matters a little if the road is wide or narrow. It matters a little how many people are on the road, whether there are lots of potholes or not, how the scenery is on the road. But the most important feature of a road is, does it get where you want to go? And notice the destination of the wide road in Jesus' word picture. It might look pretty, it might be nice and easy, it looks really popular, but it says in verse 13 that wide road leads to destruction. That's not a destination that I want to set in my GPS. It leads to destruction. And then the other road, that narrow road, it says in verse 14, leads to life. It might feel like you're the only one taking that exit. It doesn't seem popular, but look where it leads. It leads to life. In a few minutes, we're going to dig more into this stark contrast that Jesus draws here. But for now, let's ask ourselves the question, will we go the way of the crowd or the way of Christ? Do we want to go the direction that everybody else is going, or do we want to do what Jesus calls us to do? Will you go the way of the crowd or the way of Christ? And notice, he's talking about a gate. He's talking about a road or a way. Wonder what those things actually are. Well, look at some words Jesus says in another gospel. In John chapter 10, verse 9, Jesus says, I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. Not only does he tell us to take the narrow gate, he tells us he is the narrow gate. And then John 14, verse 6, Jesus answered, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. He not only tells us to take the narrow way, he tells us he is the narrow way. He is both the entry point, the gate into the life that God calls us to live, and he is the path. He is the one we follow, the one we stay in step with along the way. And if you want to avoid destruction, Jesus says, take the narrow gate, the Jesus gate, and take the narrow way, the Jesus way. So that's the first picture he paints for us, the two roads. And then he paints a picture of the two trees. Listen to what he says in verses 15 through 23. Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit, you will recognize them. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. Jesus says that in the world there are true prophets and there are false prophets, fake prophets. They pose as sheep, but actually they're wolves. And he says there are true disciples and false disciples or fake disciples. They might have, those false ones might have the religious lingo down. They call Jesus Lord, Lord. They do lots of impressive things, but they don't live their lives in step with Jesus. And he says you can tell the difference between a fake prophet and a real one, between a fake disciple and a real one, by their fruit. What is the stuff that comes out of their lives? How do they make a difference in the world or not make a difference in the world? How are they showing evidence that they're being changed from the inside? It is by your fruit that you will know them. And Jesus calls us to live in a fruitful relationship with him. There are two problems with a fake tree, with a fake disciple, with a fake prophet. The first is that there's no fruit or bad fruit. The second is that there's no relationship. Jesus says in verse 23, away from me, I never knew you. The problem with these fake disciples and these fake prophets is that they're just posing, they're pretending that they know him. They don't actually have a deep daily interaction with him, a relationship that transforms and makes us people who bear fruit for him. And we need to ask ourselves the question, is your discipleship fake or real? Are you just putting on a show for him? Jesus has told us again and again through the Sermon on the Mount that it's a dangerous thing if we just focus on the externals while the inside is still a mess and still turned away from him. Are we just posing, or are we actually trusting him and following him? It's not a performance for people, but a reality. Is your discipleship fake or real? I have a ficus tree in my office. It's made of plastic. I have never once picked good fruit from that tree. It just doesn't happen. And if you're faking it, your life is not going to be fruitful. Well, then there's one more picture that Jesus paints. And Kimberly's going to come and help us understand this one, this last words of the Sermon on the Mount. a description of two houses. Fill us in about this.
So not only are there two houses, but there's a storm involved. And so I moved to Missouri from Texas about 6 years ago, and I discovered pretty quickly that in Missouri, if I said, picture a storm, a very different type of storm comes to your mind here than in Texas. Here in Missouri, most people think of a tornado. In Texas, most people think of a hurricane. And both, I don't want to experience either of them for different reasons, but I also noticed that they're kind of scary, right? And we went to Galveston quite frequently. That's a small town on the coast of Texas, on the ocean. And I noticed that the houses in Galveston are built differently than the houses in Missouri. First of all, houses in Missouri have a basement. That was kind of cool here. I like basements. Houses in Galveston, when you're on the beach, they're built on stilts. So they have like the house up in the air and they have all these legs because the sand is not a great thing to build a house on, especially when water is involved. And so as we're reading through these storms, picture a storm, choose one of your tornado or maybe your hurricane, and let's check out in Matthew 7, verses 24 through 27, what Jesus has to say. It says, "Therefore, anyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down and the streams rose and the wind blew and beat against the house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the wind blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash." Okay, so just in case you need a little practice with your imagination, I brought you something to picture on this story. So first we have a house that's built on a rock. And what did it say? The wind came and it blew, and I don't have any rain, I'm sorry. And what happened to the house? It's not going anywhere, right? It's a pretty strong house built on strong rock. But then we have over here, we have some sand, real sand. What happened? Same thing, right? The wind blew, there was water, pretend the water, and what happened? Kaboom, as we say with my 1-year-old, kaboom. It fell down with a great crash, with a great kaboom. Which house do you want to live in right now? I don't want to be sideways like this house. I would love to live in this house on the rock. So Jesus uses stories to teach a lesson. He doesn't just tell us stories for fun. And this big idea is that Jesus wants your life to be constructed in a way that when the storms of life come, when those rains come, when life is hard, scary, bad, you are storm-proof. That you aren't swept away in the storm, that you stand firm on the rock. Or to take the metaphor away completely, Jesus wants you to live your life in a way that when those good, bad, hard, scary things happen, you stand strong, right? You aren't like this house that's over here sideways. So let's take a closer look at these two builders because they have a lot in common, right? They both built a house. And it says they both heard Jesus. It's really interesting to point out that it's not like Jesus told this story of there were these two people and one listened to Jesus and built his house on the rock and the other person ignored Jesus. No, or they didn't hear Jesus. Both of the builders, both of the people in this story, they heard Jesus. And then you notice both of them had storms, right? They both faced storms. This one had a storm, this one had a storm. And if you notice in verses 25 and 27, the words used to describe it are exactly the same. This one didn't get a pitiful storm. This one had the same strength of a storm as this one. And so the story was not, do what I say and sunny skies will happen and there will never be any trouble in your life and all will be well. It says there was a storm and there was a storm. So what's the difference? Oh, one more similarity. I jumped the gun. The houses are the same. They built the same house. They are identical. People heard Jesus. There were two storms. They built the same house. So what is the difference? You can answer that question. One's built on the sand, one's built on the rock. Different foundations built on different things. The rock, it was solid. It was unmoving. There was hot glue involved. The sand, there was sand. It was shifting. Not a great foundation. Not a great foundation. The houses were the same. They were built strong, but the storm showed their weakness. The storm revealed the strength of the foundation, the weakness of the foundation, the wisdom of the builder, the foolishness of the builder. The different foundations led to different outcomes. So as I said, Jesus tells stories to teach lessons. And there is one thing that you can do to make yourself like this builder, so that you're not this one. So that you can be like this builder, building your house on the rock. When your tornado or your hurricane or your other natural disaster that you're picturing comes, you are standing firm. What can you do? It's your response to Jesus. Both of those builders heard Jesus, and they had completely different responses to what Jesus said. One listened and lived their life as usual. Just went along their way, ignored the words of Jesus. The other one listened and built a house on the rock, changed his life. So the secret to a storm-proof life, do what Jesus says.
Between that builder and that builder, that one did what Jesus said. That one heard what Jesus said, but didn't do it. That makes all the difference in the world. If we want to live stormproof, we must hear the words of Jesus, and we trust him so much that we actually do what he says. We put his words into practice. We listen to it, and we live it. That's how we build our lives on solid rock. If you were taking notes with a pen on a piece of paper and you wrote down that phrase, do what Jesus says, I want you to circle the name Jesus, because really what's important is that we do what Jesus says. There are so many voices speaking to you, and you might have lots of different people that you're letting kind of guide your life. Maybe you do what your friends say. Maybe you do what a voice from your past says. Maybe you do what your favorite political podcaster says. Maybe you do what you say. You're in charge of your own life. But the key is to do what Jesus says, to listen to his voice, because if you listen to the wrong voice, you're going to get in all kinds of trouble. But if you're writing those notes down, not only do I want you to circle the name Jesus, I want you to underline the word do, because Jesus makes it clear that the key is to do what Jesus says. The contrast that he draws is not between the person who hears Jesus and the person who ignores him. We might expect that to be what he says, that those of us who come to church on Sundays and we listen to the words of Jesus, we're building our lives on a solid foundation. And those people outside, those losers who don't listen to Jesus, they're building it on shifting sand. But no, that's not what he says. He says we've got to do what he says, not just hear it. To hear plus obey leads to a solid foundation. To hear plus trusting him enough that we actually follow his teaching, that leads to a solid foundation. To hear plus nothing, to hear plus just go ahead and do what you want to do, that leads to a shaky foundation of sand. Jesus' little brother, James, made the same point in his book in chapter 1, verse 22, when he says, don't merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves, do what it says. Hearing Jesus is not enough. Think of your GPS on your phone. If you hear the words, turn right in 1/4 mile, but a 1/4 mile comes and you just keep going straight, it really didn't matter that you heard those words because you didn't put them into practice. If you go to a movie and you're watching the movie and the fire alarm starts going off and people start hollering, fire, get out, and you think, I hear the alarm, I hear the people saying fire, but I'm gonna sit here and keep enjoying my popcorn, then it didn't really matter that you heard the words because you didn't do what they said. If you are playing for the Royals and you are running the bases and you round second and you see that third base coach waving his arm and he's saying, go, 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 but you stop at third base, it doesn't matter that you heard what he said because you didn't do it. If you have a friend who says, hey, meet me at 3rd Street Social this afternoon, I'm treating for lunch, and those words register in your ears and in your brain, you hear them, you understand them, but you don't show up for lunch, then it didn't do you any good. Hearing is not enough. Jesus wants us to listen to him and obey him. Now, here's a moment where I think if you're paying attention, your toes are going to get stepped on. I know mine are. The thing that Jesus condemns in this last story in the Sermon on the Mount is exactly what we normally do. In fact, for most of you, the thing that Jesus condemns was your plan this morning. I'm going to get up, I'm going to come to church, I'm going to listen to the words of Jesus, and then I'm going to go on with my life. Dallas Willard, my favorite Christian thinker, says, we as Christians have institutionalized the house on the sand. We've created an environment where we encourage people to come to a worship service, come to a group, listen to the words of Jesus, and then just go out and don't do anything any different. Jesus wants us not only to hear, but to do. That, if we just hear him and then ignore, that's exactly what Jesus says is foolish. That's exactly what Jesus says leaves us vulnerable to storms. We've got to do what he says. So here's a big question to ask yourself. Will you admire Jesus or follow him? Are you going to politely hear the words of Jesus, then go about your business? Or are you going to respect him so much that you rearrange your life around doing what he says? We've got a room full of admirers of Jesus. You love him so much that you got up earlier than you had to on a Sunday and you came, you've sung songs to him. You might have a cross on your necklace. You might have a fish on your car. You might serve on some committees at the church. You might volunteer and give. And every now and then you do what Jesus wants you to do. You listen politely to sermons. But do you follow him? Do you obey him? Do you actually do what he says? If following Jesus means I've got to humbly apologize to somebody that I've wronged, are you really going to do that? If following Jesus means I'm going to stop sleeping with somebody that I'm not married to, are you going to do that? If saying yes to Jesus means I'm going to have to get his help with a troubling habit that I struggle with, are you really going to do what he calls you to do? Maybe you respect him enough to show up on Sunday morning, to sing to him, to listen to his words, but do you want to do what he says? Jesus wants more than your admiration. He wants you to follow him. He wants you to trust him enough that you do what he says. Back in the 1850s, there was a famous tightrope walker named Charles Blondin. And in 1859, he had a tightrope strung across Niagara Falls, 1,100 feet long, 160 feet above the water. And he called a huge crowd together to witness as he walked across the tightrope all the way across Niagara Falls. As he reached the end, he did a somersault off of the tightrope just for a little added flair. And over the next several days, he repeated the trip multiple times, making it a little more challenging each time. He walked across on stilts one time. He walked across pushing a wheelbarrow. He stopped in the middle, made himself an omelet and ate it, and then finished the journey one time. And as the crowd was going wild for all that he was doing, at the end of one of the trips, he asked, "Who believes that I could cross this tightrope carrying someone on my back?" And the crowd went wild and said, "Yeah, we believe, we believe, we believe." And then he asked for volunteers. And the enthusiasm died down a little bit. But then someone raised their hand. His name's Harry Colcord. I want to show you a picture. Take a look here on the screens. Harry Colcord was Blondin's manager, and he knew what Blondin can do, and he not only believed it, but he put his trust in Blondin, climbed on his back, and rode across Niagara Falls on a tightrope. Well, Jesus is telling us in the Sermon on the Mount, I don't just want you to applaud me from the riverbank. I don't want you to just think in your head that I know what I'm talking about. I want you to trust me enough to let me carry you. I want your theology to become biography. I want you to listen and to believe, but more than that, I want you to obey. I want you to live with me as your Lord. And that brings us to our response. And notice these last couple of verses of Matthew 7, the response to Jesus' original preaching of this message. verses 28 and 29. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. It's kind of an ironic end, because yeah, it's good that they realize Jesus is not like any other teacher. Man, he's got some authority. Wow, he's impressive. But that wasn't his goal with the sermon. He didn't just want to impress them. He didn't just want their applause. He wanted obedience. He didn't just want fans. He wanted followers. And he makes it clear that we must make a choice. And there is no third option. We've got to choose. Notice that all the word pictures Jesus paints have two very distinct options and no middle third option. There is a narrow gate and a wide gate, and not a in-between Goldilocks kind of gate. There's a narrow road that leads to life and a wide road that leads to destruction. And there is not a middle option of kind of a nice meandering path. There's not an option of just sit still where you are. You either take the narrow road to life or the wide road to destruction. He says there's a good tree and a bad tree. There's no kind of C+ tree in the middle. You've got to decide. You're either going to be real or you're going to be fake. There's a well-built house that is built on doing what Jesus says, and it will stand through the storms. And there is a poorly built house on sand, and it will not survive. And one day, all of humanity is going to be divided into two camps. There are the people who trust Jesus and follow him, and the people who reject him. And there's not a third option. There's not a nice, safe, respectable, successful group of people who just kind of admire Jesus from afar. You've got to decide. Joshua in the Old Testament says, choose this day whom you will serve. We must make a choice. And we need to be clear about the consequences. If you choose that wide gate and that wide road with all those popular folks heading that way, it says clearly in verse 13 that it leads to destruction. That's the outcome you're choosing. And if you choose to build your life on anything other than doing what Jesus says, then you're headed for a great crash, it says in verse 27. Every time I read those words of Jesus, I'm reminded of a time in my childhood when my dad hung our bicycles on this elaborate rope system that he built over the top of our garage or over the cars inside our garage. And my brother and my mom and I were kind of suspicious of how this was going to turn out. And my dad was so confident, he said, you couldn't knock those bicycles down with a baseball bat. Well, about 15 minutes later, we were eating dinner in the kitchen right next to the garage, and we heard a great crash as every single one of those bicycles fell down on top of the cars. Well, that's the ending of the Sermon on the Mount, a great crash. Do you notice that the Sermon on the Mount does not end with a happy ending? The last words are literally great crash. Jesus warns us, Jesus threatens us basically, that if we have listened to all these nice 3 chapters worth of teaching and we just go on about our business like nothing ever happened, then we are a foolish person. And when the storms come, and they're going to come, we're going to crash. There is a Niagara Falls of sin between you and the life that you want to live, a life connected to God, life with forgiveness, life with purpose, life that will last forever. And you can't get to the other side of that chasm. You can't get there on your own. And Jesus says, get on my back. He lived and died and rose again for you, and he is offering to give you the benefit of the life that he lived and the death that he died and the resurrection that he experienced, and he wants to carry you. He wants you to put your sins on him, your plans on him, your mind on him, your struggles on him, yourself on him. And I want to challenge you to pray today, Jesus, you are Lord, and I will build my life on you. You are the king. You are the boss. I'm not going to just treat you like you're a consultant anymore, where I ask your advice and then decide what I'm going to do with it. I'm going to trust that you know what is best, and I'm going to follow you. I'm going to step out of the admirer category and into the devoted follower category. I will need your help, Jesus, but I want to build my life on you and on doing what you say. Would you bow with me for just a moment? And I want to encourage you to just have a little one-on-one conversation with Jesus right now. What is it that he has said to you? What does he want to transform in you? Maybe this morning, for the first time, you've become aware of your need to give your life to him, the one who lived and died and rose again for you, the one who taught so profoundly, who showed such wisdom. You realize that you can trust him with your whole life. And you want to receive his forgiveness, his new start, and trust him as the one who saves you and as the Lord who leads you. Tell him that's what you want. Maybe there's a specific area of your life where you've been withholding obedience. You know what he says, you know what he wants for you. The trouble isn't hearing him, the trouble isn't believing him, the trouble is just doing what he says. Tell him that you want his help to obey him. That you really believe that doing what he says is the only way to have a solid foundation in life. Jesus, help us as we respond to you. In your name we pray. Amen.